We are profoundly grateful to be able to organize this event on this unceded land. And I offer my acknowledgement knowing that it doesn't erase the legacy of colonization, nor the need for us to question our responsibilities and actions. Africa, Mindy, Sandrina, and I are grateful for the support we received from the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council to make this event a reality. We're also grateful for the generous financial support provided by the University of Victoria's Centre of Global Studies and the Centre for Asia-Pacific Initiatives. We want to thank the director of the School of Child and Youth Care, Dr. Jennifer White, who has given us invaluable support. The Faculty of Human and Social Development has also been instrumental in putting this conference. And I want to thank our Dean, Dr. Mary Ellen Perkins, who I invite now to say a few words.
Thanks so much, Veronica. I'm very pleased to be here this morning. My name is Mary Ellen Perkins. I am Dean of the Faculty of Human and Social Development, and very pleased to be and very grateful to have lived on these territories for the past 22 years. For those of you who are joining us from very far away, I'm so pleased to welcome you here to Victoria and to our campus on such a glorious morning. And for those of you who come from Victoria, I know, like me, you will be grateful to see the sunshine come back again, because we've had a very gray and wet week this past week. The discussions that you're clearly engaged in here at this conference are so important. What do we mean when we invoke the idea of environment in any of the disciplines that I know are gathered here in this room today? How can we think about our personal and our collective relationships to that environment? And perhaps most importantly, as Veronica has already noted, how can we act responsibly and accountably within that relationship? I'm very pleased that you're here to engage in these conversations together. I hope you enjoy your time together and have excellent conversations. And do, I hope, get out and enjoy some sunshine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I have one more very special thank you. As you all know, because one way or another you have communicated with her, this event might not have been possible without the generosity, hard work, gentle organizing, and great sense of humor of Narda Nelson. Narda is a graduate student here at the School of Child and Youth Care. Colonial, who is also a graduate student, has also given us many hours and attended to every detail to ensure the symposium's success. Thank you. And while I mentioned them last, they're not the least. I want to thank you, all of my past and current graduate students, for their help, their inspiration, and their dedication. Now, let's focus on the event. This lecture series, Learning to Inherit, responds to exciting new dialogues and synergies that have recently emerged between the indigenous and environmental humanities. These dialogues are largely motivated by the intense and rapidly escalating social and ecological challenges we all now face. The premise of these dialogues is that we as human beings cannot carry on as we have in the past. We have to find new ways of thinking, acting, and relating to the rest of the world. Scholars in the environmental and indigenous humanities are leading the way in theorizing the social, political, and ethical implications of the interdependency and mutual vulnerabilities of humans, other life forms, and the Earth's geo-ecological systems. They are challenging us to learn to inherit these entangled legacies. They're asking us to rethink the human, not as separate from, but as an integral part of bio-ecological systems, and to reposition these systems within the domain of ethics and responsibility. These dialogues have clear implications for the field of early childhood education. Children in contemporary early childhood settings are inheriting increasingly complex and challenging common worlds. But mainstream Eurocentric pedagogies seldom support them to engage meaningfully with these worlds. For a while now, we, the organizers of this conference, have been contemplating the pedagogical implications and affordances of common worlds we co-inhabit with a whole host of other species, entities, and forces. As we push beyond the prevailing humanist educational paradigm and its preoccupation with the development of the individual child, we deliberately reposition children within the full, heterogeneous, and interdependent multi-species life worlds in which we all actually live. In line with this shift, beyond the social or beyond the exclusively human, we also move away from the child-centered pedagogies that predominate early childhood education. We focus instead on the manners and means through which children learn from engaging with these other species, entities, and forces in their immediate common worlds. We are convinced that the time is ripe for these important conversations between the indigenous and environmental humanities and the field of early childhood education. The goal of this lecture series is to spark this dialogue. Dr. Marie Baptiste began the conversation yesterday. And it is my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Myra, who will explore the colonial and ecological implications of waste and question the ethics of bequeathing waste to future generations in the Anthropocene. Myra is a professor and Queen's National Scholar in the School of Environmental Studies at Queen's University in Ontario. Her work has been very influential in our thinking. Pushing beyond the course to human exceptionalism is not an easy task in early childhood education. Yet we have been very well assisted in challenging narrow human-centric assumptions about children's significant relations by Myra's insightful science and environmental sociologies that remind us, as she said, that the less glamorous but nevertheless essential and real action takes place backstage. Myra's suggestion that we need to disengage ourselves from humanism's profoundly myopic ontologies and ethics has been extremely influential in our thinking of common worlds pedagogies. In particular, her environmental ethics of vulnerability has helped us recognize that although all species have inherited and are co-implicated in the environmental uncertainty and mess we now find ourselves in, it might well be that we humans are among the most vulnerable species of all. And that, to address these ethical issues, we might need to work with young children to inherit ecological challenges through pedagogies that situate humans within the environment and integrate environmental and social justice and ethics. More recently, Meyer provoked us to think about how we might prefigure our relations with waste in early childhood education communities. And it is the topic of waste that she will address today. Please join me in welcoming Myra.
Okay, well, no pressure with that introduction. Let's see. I've got a little clicker here, so let's see what we can do. Okay, well, I need to add my thanks as well. So I thank Veronica and Afrika and Mindy and Sandrina and Narada, wherever you are. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here. I'm grateful. I'm really looking forward to continuing our discussions. I thought they were really great sessions yesterday, and I hope what I have to contribute today will add to the fodder of our discussion. So, and I also, if I may, I want to make a shout out to my friend Paula Dunn, who's sitting there, who Paula knew me before I was an adult. Which is going back some time now. She still looks like she's 20, but I'm somehow aged. Anyway, Paula's come to watch this, so I just wanted to say it's really nice to have you here.
I promise not to heckle.
No, go ahead. All right, and I also really must thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. I have been so fortunate to have been funded by SURE for lots of years now, and I continue to be funded by SURE. And I'm just, if you happen to have any of you out there being one of the reviewers for any of my applications, thank you so much, because I couldn't do what I do without them. So what I'm going to do now then is just, I can't remember what's next. Oh yeah. So what I'm going to do now is to I'm going to read my paper. I apologize. I'm going to give you an abstract of what this whole paper is about, and then I'm basically going to look at two what I used to call case studies, but what Donna Haraway calls attachment sites, because she uses language so much better than I ever will. So I'm going to talk to you about two attachment sites that I am working with around the topic of waste. And one of them is in southern Canada and the other is in northern Canada. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's get started here then. All right, so Canada's waste landscape is as much colonial as it is ecological, as much inherited as it is bequeathed to future generations to resolve. Through a compendium of field notes, participant observation, interviews, archival research, what I'm going to do today is examine two Canadian waste landscapes that invite questions about what it is and is not meant, what's meant to be seen, what's not meant to be seen, uncovered, dealt with, admired, and trusted, and forgotten. This presentation reflects upon what it means to be interested in and curious about our waste legacy, how to prepare for, represent, and participate in waste landscapes, attending as much to geobiological processes as human political economic practices. The presentation takes up the challenge posed by Deepesh Chakrabarty to conceptualize the neo-colonial subject within the context of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, as Chakrabarty argues, recharacterizes the neo-colonial subject as both the colonized and, as a geological force, the re-indigenized. And while the Anthropocene speaks of a globalized human race to whom past and present generations project responsibility and reparation, we emphasize what I'm going to talk about today, that the effects of this waste landscape, neocolonialism's dividend, if you will, is differentially experienced by neocolonial subjects, such as Inuit peoples in Canada's north, which is what I'm going to focus on. All right, so let's go to this first attachment site. And this is an attachment site that's all focused on participating politics around waste. So, if any of you have heard me talk, you'll get really sick of me droning on about waste, but it is my life now. And I always, just a little bit of a refresher course. We are in Canada. Here's our waste landscape here. So we are the highest producer of municipal solid waste in the world. We beat the US back in 2005, I think. We produce the most waste in the world. And our municipal solid waste is not the most waste we produce. Actually, the most waste we produce in Canada is mining waste. We have the world's largest mine. We produce huge amounts of mining waste. We also produce huge amounts of industrial waste and lots of other different kinds of waste. So we top the world, not only in energy use, but in the production of waste. We produce well over a ton of municipal solid waste annually, most of which is landfill. And municipalities, of course, across the country are grappling with what to do with this waste. Many landfills are overfull, they're at capacity, they're closed, and of course no one wants them in their backyard. One of the things that we do a lot in Canada is to transport our waste. So we transport our waste to other regions in Canada. We transport a lot of our waste to the United States, and we transport our waste further afield to places like China, Korea, etc. And when you talk about e-waste, then it goes further, Mexico, India, etc. My research collaborators and I completed an empirical study of waste management in a city in southern Ontario. And this city, like many in Canada, has faced landfill closure, and it's transporting all of its waste now, and much of its diverted waste, by which I mean what people call recycling, to other provinces and countries. With the transportation costs increasing, this is a big thing in waste, is how much it costs to use non-renewable fossil fuels. Public memories of a landfill in the vicinity of the city contain contaminants and leaching out into the environment. And a municipal city council intent on making this city the most sustainable in Canada. There's a number of municipalities across Canada that are claiming this. The city is primed for public consultation and engaged citizenship, which sounds great, doesn't it? Engaged citizenship, that is what we're all after. But of course, what our study found is that in this city, like most in southern regions of Canada, waste is largely a banal, mundane, and highly routinized practice. Indeed, waste management is a particularly robust site of neoliberal governmentality, or as Latour would have it, what he calls Politics 5, which describes, I'm quoting him, all those institutions that appear on the surface to be absolutely apolitical, and yet in their silent, ordinary, fully routinized ways, they're perversely the most important aspects of what it means for us to live together, even though no one raises hell about them, and they hardly stir, as he calls them, congressmen out of their parliamentary slumbers. This form of governance leads to waste management's configuration as a technological issue, supported by norms and practices of individual responsibility, and I'm going to belabor this for a minute. Waste management is largely thus structured as a matter of responding to individual citizens' waste needs, right? Framing waste management as a technological issue circumscribes discussions to focus on better waste management technologies, longer-serving landfill liners, better ways of disposing of incinerator fly ash, and so on, and diversion, by which we primarily mean recycling, the latter for which members of the public are largely held responsible. This articulation of governmentality, then, instrumentalizes a particular public in relation to waste, one that conceptualizes waste at the individual level, be resolved with downstream technoscientific responsibility for responses, which in turn leads to differential assessments of waste management risk among scientists, members of the public, community groups, government officials, and so on. So, well, this is a conference about early childhood education, so I thought I would talk about this for a little while, because I am not an early childhood educator. I barely count myself as an educator at all. So so these are random shots I've taken. This is from, I go to these industry waste management expos, right, which they are across Canada. And this was on the ceiling, the best products for the worst stuff on earth. You know, so this is very much encapsulates that sort of techno-scientific fix, right? We throw science and technology at it. It's very much, you know, in keeping with the Anthropocene, right? We'll put iron filings in the atmosphere, or we're going to put up giant solar panels, or we're going to do, you know, all of these techno-scientific fixes, which is going to save us from the Anthropocene. Yeah? And this is very much in southern Canada, the way what waste is handled. Yeah? recycling. Recycling is what most people think of in Canada when we think about waste, yeah? And this is something that we are very much encouraged to do, and in fact, our environmental citizenship is formed, is managed. Our identities as environmental citizens is often played out in practices of recycling, yeah? And this is something that we do. We just this morning when I was printing out my paper at the hotel, it was a PC, and I don't know how to use PCs on Mac. And so when it was printing, it printed one-sided. And this, of course, caused me anxiety because it's one-sided, right? So now I'm going to have to cart this back with me to Montreal to make sure that I use the other side of the paper, and I'm going to have to rip it up and make sure that I write in the margins before I can put it in, of course, my recycling bin, right? Because that's what makes, you know, that's what makes me a responsible environmental citizen, right? And, you know, we are all carrying around our waste so that we can find the right receptacle to put it in and all that kind of stuff, right? Recycling is how we typically in the South deal with waste. It's how we have a relationship with waste. You know, most of our waste, what we do is we just, you know, we stick it in the bin, right? And as soon as we've done that, as soon as we've stuck it in the garbage, then, you know, I don't know what happens in Victoria, but I'm going to guess. As we wandered lovely around the countryside with Africa trying to get us to that place yesterday, I saw a number of Waste Management Incorporated trucks, which is the largest waste management corporation in the world, that's picking up from at least, you know, some of the municipalities here clearly. And yeah, so we, you know, and they probably, I mean, where I live, they pick up the garbage very early in the morning, so most people are still asleep. You know, you stick it out on your curb or you stick it wherever you are in your apartment building, and it magically disappears, and it goes somewhere, and it's out of sight and out of mind, yeah? So our relationship with waste then is with you know, these recyclables, these things that we are trying to divert from the landfill. Okay, but, you know, and of course our government really encourages recycling, our municipalities encourage recycling, and our education system very much encourages recycling. And I'm going to guess that UVic has lots of stuff on recycling, lots and lots of stuff on recycling. They wouldn't be a university institution if they didn't. So, okay, but I don't know if you can read any of these things. They're probably too small, but okay. So, you know, recycling, as we know, has been a really dominant environmental discourse since the early 1970s, yeah? It hasn't decreased rates of extraction at all. It releases hazardous waste by byproduct emissions. A good example of that is paper. Paper's a really bad thing to recycle because in that process, the paper has to be not just collected using non-renewable fossil fuels in transportation, but then it has to be re-dyed. And in that process of re-dyeing, we release really highly toxic chemicals into the environment. Yeah, so we use a lot of non-renewable fossil fuels transporting all this stuff around, right? It has zero impact on resource conservation. And the recycling, of course, is done by waste management corporations, right? Whose interest in it is, of course, for profit, right? Which means that materials are like plastics, glass, etc., are only recycled if there's a profit in it. These, and the profit varies pretty much daily. You can sort of chart it on the stock market. And if there's not a profit for it, then companies will move all of this stuff to landfills. So the quotes dirty little secret, if you read recycling literature, and they call it the dirty little secret, is that much of the stuff that we diligently put into those green bins, blue bins, whatever your gray bins, whatever, I don't know what the colors are here, but ends up in landfills anyway. But we just feel good when we put it in these other things, yeah. Recycling is at most a third of our municipal solid waste, and of course our municipal solid waste is a smaller fraction of the waste that we're producing, right? It doesn't reduce any health risks, etc. There's lots and lots of literature on this, okay? But, yet, right? In the States, more Americans recycle than vote. It's super popular. It's really, really popular to recycle, yeah? It focuses on the individual consumer and the local scale of economy pictures and they're trying to, all of that, it's busy work, right? It's deflecting, of course, from the real waste issues, which don't have anything to do with the diversion, yeah? Or it's, as Princeton says, it's unpolitics, right? It's become unpolitical to, to engage in these practices, right? So it deflects, as you can see here, this interest in producer regulation, industrial and military waste, of which we have an inordinate amount in Canada, yeah? Here's our Canada's Green Plan. Here's what our government has to say. This is perfect. I mean, I wish, it's like the perfect quote. Self-regulation is better than government regulation, right? And voluntary action is the most effective way to achieve enduring results. Right on, yeah? That's it. That is it. And look how well we are self-regulating ourselves, yeah? So, all right, so that means that most research then focuses on how do we get people to be better environmental citizens? How do we get people to recycle better? Yeah? Of the 3 R's, the reduce, reuse, recycle, we focus almost exclusively on recycling because it doesn't disturb our capitalist circuits of production and consumption, right? Reduction is the obvious one, and in Canada that's extremely clear, yeah? But that's not the one we focus on. We sometimes focus on reusing, things like fabrics, that sort of thing. Most of it, though, is on recycling. All right, and so we use these, deficit models, the nudge models, how we nudge people into being good environmental citizens, shaming exercises. In the study we did, we found lots of shaming exercises. People write into the local newspapers all the time. My neighbors just put their stuff in the garbage, and I have tons of these quotes if you're interested. I carry my coffee cup things back from Starbucks and I put them in my recycling at home because I'm a good citizen. Yeah, I'm actually quoting a newspaper article. Pride exercises in this place that we did our study. The city council trying to, be the most sustainable city in Canada has this program and it's called, Good Recyclers or something like that. And if you are one of the 10 households in the city that are really good recyclers, you get a sticker on your recycling boxes so that all your neighbors can see that you are a great recycler. And they have programs, of course, of getting kids involved in this and families involved in this and blah, 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 yeah? Which, of course, leads me to, and now I'm going to show you some photos. I now take just lots of photos of waste wherever I go. So here, this for me is the environmental citizen. So this is a garbage can somewhere in a park in Stockholm. And this, if in Sweden, lots of people live in apartments, they all seem to have dogs, and they all take their dogs for lots of walks, because they're good people. And they, I don't know if you can see this, but this garbage can is filled to the brim with garbage, right? They have tiny little garbage cans, right? Because they want everyone to recycle. But around the garbage can, of course, are these little plastic bags filled with dog shit. Right? And these citizens are trying to be so good that they put these close to the garbage, right? Because they can't put it in the garbage because it's too full. So they've all diligently put them like close to the garbage. Yeah, and I've watched garbage collectors come and pick them up, and they pick up all these things as well, right? Because they're being good citizens. Here I was in Munich, and I was just happened to be. They put me up in a hotel where it happened to be like Environment Day in Munich. And so for like, I don't know, a whole day, might have been 2, I can't remember, but they blocked off this major street and they had all of these exhibitions on being a good environment and CO2 emissions and blah, 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 blah. We know these because we all go to these things, right? And, lots of families, lots of, balloons, great ideas about how we can save the planet. And then I went out the next morning, and this is the cleanup from Environment Day, right? And this will all be taken to, it's Germany, so it'll all be taken to an energy from waste facility, or it'll be transported to other countries like Sweden that imports waste. All right, so this leads me to early childhood education. the best environmental citizens, and we spend a lot of time educating our children as parents, as adults, and as professional educators in getting our children to do this, right? So, to be a recycling superhero, Marie asked yesterday a really great question about what does it mean to be a warrior in today's society. You know, she was asking Earl this yesterday, and I kept thinking about this and thinking about this, and I was really taken by that question. I thought it was a really interesting question, and I think in southern Canada, you know, when we're talking about the environment, we're talking about children. I think this is what it means. This is what it means. It means to be a recycling superhero. So there's, look at that great white mom with her white son, and they're holding that recycling thing together with their plastic bottles, which are well, anyway. But here we've got here are university students, because they too are, you know, our future, and they are, look, they're smiling and they're recycling. They're sorting through, diverting these. They're wearing green T-shirts that have been made to show that they are good environmental citizens. These are easy to get off the web. I just did this last week. And so here we've got superhero recycling team, Captain KC, Mr. Recycle, Captain Planet Foundation, Earth Day Kids Fest, calling all superheroes. Please enjoy and share our fun activities. This is this Planet Protectors Club. So it's not just recycling. They're going to now protect the planet for us, right? This is the Anthropocene, right? This is, we've totally screwed it up, right? It's already, you know, we can't figure it out. We're going to like send filings into the atmosphere. That's our big idea, right? So now it's children. So we have embedded children with this. And, you know, I teach my grad students to never use anecdotes. But here I go. Because I'm old and I can't. You know, if my children come home from school with one more frickin' recycling t-shirt, I am going to, well, I don't know, I wouldn't march up to the school because I don't want my kids to get kicked out. And I don't want to be the problem parent, right? So, but, you know, they are constantly, I think my daughter must have been, I don't know, 7 or 8, the first time she, you know, collapsed in tears at bedtime about how, you know, the planet was dying and how could she save it? She's like 7 or 8. She can't save the planet. How did that happen? How did it come that our young children feel that they're responsible for it, while we are consuming massively, and we're feeding this thing about recycling as being that's how they're going to save everything. How did that happen? This is what I'm arguing is the status quo in southern Canada. This is how the Anthropocene is operating in terms of waste. Oh yeah, I could go on and on and on. You know, I don't know if you guys do the Charlie and that's a big working. Yeah. Anyway, we are extremely very good recyclers. Here's a teacher reading 3 R's to some kids there. Just in case we didn't get it, the we recycler. And you can, of course, buy like, you know, toys that are all about recycling. There's Lego stuff. If you've got young kids, you know, there's like the garbage, what do they call garbage? Packs or something. Trash packs, yes, my son got into those. And of course I had to have this long lecture to him about how we can't buy this plastic, it's about garbage, we're gonna end up throwing it away, you know. Yeah, so, okay, so what does all this mean? Okay. So our, you know, I'll put it, yeah, I'll leave it as recyclers. So our empirical research collaborates lots of different, you know, we're not the only people saying this, of course, in suggesting that this is how waste is governed in southern Canada. Waste management industries operate in tandem with municipal governments, and they increasingly ask members of the public to accede to prescribed assessment exercises that circumscribe the parameters to discussions of end-of-pipe responses like disposal and recycling. Once this key parameter is set in advance, discussions are further circumscribed to decisions on a limited number of sites, technologies, consultation, discussion events, and timeframes. Multinational corporations specializing in waste technology assessment, siting, construction, operations, monitoring, closure, and aftercare increasingly manage this framing. With on-site engineers and scientists, networks with government, and sophisticated, well-budgeted in-house public relations management teams, these new brokers increasingly manage our waste. And they increasingly manage how we even discuss waste. And they do this through feasibility reports, town hall meetings, presentations, and other forms of consultation. It's not that we are not consulted on waste. Members of the public are routinely consulted on waste. In fact, the government makes municipalities consult. That's not what the issue is. Neoliberal governance enhances industry's monopoly by embedding techniques such as these public consultations and feasibility studies within industry's remit. In other words, geoengineering then is the primary way in which we have learned to talk about waste. Waste only moves from this sort of mundane object, this out of sight, out of mind, when something happens. And when something happens, it tends to be things like landfill closures, leachate, leakage, dump fires, these sorts of things, right? And only at those times do members of the public, as Latour would say, sort of temporarily wake up. And what they wake up to tends to be concerns with health, public health, and with the environment. But what we're arguing is that even in these instances, even if you're talking about Burnaby or any of the, the areas around here where there has been a lot of public outcry, a lot of public protest, that what is being protested and how it is being protested is still, nevertheless, very much managed by industry. And that industry is managing government as well, yeah? So, what then gets, the ways in which activist community groups form their protests become very much embedded in, for instance, end of pipe, disposal things, time frames, consultation exercises, all of these things are all focused on the remit that industry and government has set out. They tend almost never to talk about the upstream. Why do we produce this much waste? What is our ethical relationship with waste? These sorts of questions. Yeah? Because, from a scientific point of view, of course, these are all the unknown unknowns, right? As Rumsford famously said, right? Scientists like to talk about known knowns. That's the risks they like to talk about, which tend to be really short term, because they can actually measure these things and make statements about them, right? But they're less easy on the known unknowns, contaminants of emerging concern, for instance, and really don't like to talk about, for obviously clear reasons, the unknown unknowns. This is what members of the public are interested in. But when these discussions happen, when these protests happen, they tend to all be circumscribed around this remit that industry has set. Yeah? The point is that unlike phenomena like climate change, that's readily identified with the Anthropocene as constituting a quote, great time of peril, waste flows in southern Canada are remarkably out of sight and out of mind. Geoengineering, waste management technologies don't garner the same media and public attention as those being proposed to mitigate the effects, for instance, of global warming. By the time municipalities consider a waste management technology, the need for this technology has already been established. It's already a given that we need an energy from waste facility, or we need an incinerator, or we need a new landfill. The sites being selected, risks have been identified and assessed to be within acceptable values, and often an industry-determined developer has been chosen. The increasing hegemony of multinational waste management corporations, and it's my understanding, I have to check this, but it's the second leading, after oil, it's the second largest, most powerful trading on the stock exchange, right? Bill Gates, for instance, has, while the Microsoft is being steadily losing money, he's been quietly buying waste management corporations around the globe. And, Bill Gates Foundation, all of this money is actually predicated on waste, right? So, sorry, that was a bit of an aside. Okay, and as I said, right, these multinational corporations then, they become vital allies through which municipalities attempt to turn emerging issues around waste into a technical problem, governed by clearly demarcated general will and common good, right? And this raises a really interesting, provocative article that Isabel Stenger's wrote. Obscurely, we're talking about titles. It's called Deleuze and Guattari's Last Enigmatic Message, which, I don't know. But anyway, it's this really, I encourage you to read it. It's a really, really interesting article in which she makes this provocation, and she says, a democratic public, an engaged democratic public, is a great empty idea. She says it just doesn't work. Participation, democracy, these things just don't work because this is what happens. And we would characterize this sort of participating public, the public that is recycling and determining whether we're going to have a landfill here or there, whether we're going to have an incinerator or an energy from waste facility, whether we're going to divert our waste to, Seattle, or whether it's going to be Michigan, or whether, there are styrofoams that go to China or Korea. All of these things are part of what Stenger refers to as this participating public, this democratic public. This is not where change happens, right? Because the parameters have already been set in advance, yeah? The hope, she says, in what she calls a verifying public, but I'm going to call an objecting public because I find verifying a difficult term for this. What she suggests is that if there's hope in this, it's not in a participating democratic public. It's in what I would call an objecting public. She says it's even difficult for us to even imagine what an objective public looks like because we're not used to seeing it. I want to turn to this second case study or attachment site. And what I want to argue here is that maybe the way that waste is handled in the north of Canada might just possibly, maybe, be such an objecting public. So this case study, I'm doing with one of my grad students, fantastic student, Alex Zahara, I go up. We're doing this case study in Iqaluit in Nunavut. So okay, going with this. So I know this, but just for people who aren't from Canada, Nunavut formed in 1999. It's one of the territories in Canada. It's in the green there. This is Nunavut blown up, and Iqaluit, which is the capital and only city, about 7,000 people there, in Nunavut, and it's right here on the southern end of Baffin Island. Okay, so let's get going with this possibly objecting public. So in Iqaluit, if you read the news at all, you'll know that this 4-story pile of waste, locally known as West 40 landfill, rests atop a peninsula that extends well into Nunavut's Frobisher Bay. To say that the dump rests, however, is perhaps misleading. For the fourth time in just over a year, the dump site spontaneously caught fire, and I sent Alex up there. Spent a lot of time on the dump. These are my pictures, so I apologize, not very good. But this is the dump, part of the dump. You can't really tell, but it's on fire. For nearly 2 months, the fire burned continuously, leading to a variety of responses from stakeholders. Members of the public filed numerous formal and informal complaints to the city regarding the smell and the smoke. A territorial health department advisory warned that children, women of childbearing years, pregnant women, the elderly, and those with any kind of respiratory issues shouldn't go outside. So that means healthy, postmenopausal, but pre-elderly women who are safe. Elementary school shut down twice due to children complaining of headaches, and several major community events were postponed, including the city's annual cleanup. All of this culminated in the federal and territorial government's reassurance that the public's current exposure to the dump smoke was safe for human health, or it should be safe if you're standing 70 meters at least from the dump. And the dump is, of course, right across in Decatur. It's right across from the city. Putting out the fire, which they've been doing now, it's going to take months. The way they're doing it, they hired a consultation firm from BC, and their plan, which they're executing now, is to take ocean water from the bay and to separate out bits of the waste and put the water on the waste, and then the leachate, all of the liquid would be drained off into these big, and I have some photos, leachate ponds, which would then go back into the bay. So all of the leachate from this open dump will go right into the ocean. So they actually changed the municipal bylaws so that they wouldn't have to have 3 readings of this. They actually changed them so they could do 1 reading plus another fast one. And then then they hired the consultation firm, as often happens, to actually put out the fire, right? And so they flew all their equipment and everything from BC up to Ecologically, and then they were about to start it, and then they realized that they had forgotten a couple of valves. So they flew back, picked up these valves from BC, flew back to Ecologically, and they're putting out the fire. So, let's see. Yeah, that's another one. This dump is one of many waste sites located near or within the city of Ecologically. There's Ecologically's upper base, which is the dew line. It's this distant, I'm sorry, I'm going to see if I can find a picture of it. Sorry. Yeah, this right here. So back in the day when America was afraid that the Soviet Union was going to invade the US through Canada, we put up this distant early warning system all across the north of Canada, this dew line. Here's the one that's in Ecologically. And I work with the scientist in charge of cleaning up the dew line, and she's been working on this with her vast team for the last 19 years. And what this has amounted to, the ground is so toxic, it's so contaminated that at points they've had to actually just dig up the soil and fly it down to the south of Canada where it's landfilled. And that's the only waste site in the Ecologically that has actually been remediated. Sorry, I can go back now. There's lots of these sites. Sorry. Okay, so that's the dump. There's the dump again. Okay. A more than half a century old metals dump is located nearby Territory Park. Let me see if I've got some pictures here. Yeah, here we go. Right there. Right next to the city's most popular campsite. 3 other waste sites, including the city's on-fire dump, are located at the Causeway, the city's main takeoff point for those going out on a land hunt or camp, and 2 others, which are centrally located between an under-construction airport, the college residence, and the territorial penitentiary. These sites pose a threat, as Dobbin says, to the Inuit way of life because of their desorption into local country foods, such as berries and aquatic wildlife, seal, narwhal, shellfish, etc. More than just colonial reminders, we argue these waste sites are colonial in and of themselves, forcing Inuit away from traditional activities and absorbing Inuit people further into Southern ideologies of waste management, i.e. waste as a form of capital, right? So this is, let me just show you these pictures quickly. Yes, this is, I just put these, I remember something in October. These are computer parts. This is, I don't know, this is dumb. This is some oil barrels. No one could tell me what was inside. inside them, but they're being collected next to tires, which are being collected. There's metal that's being, sorry, I feel like oh no, it's like turning over there. Collected. Here's the sewage lagoon. They pick up the sewage. I was hanging out with the guys, and they come and pick it up and they dump it in this lagoon. And I don't know if you can see, but right on the other side is Frobisher Bay. And I said, what happens when they do have a big facility for dealing with sewage, but it's never, the company that built it then left, and it's never been operational. It never worked. So what I asked the guys, what do you do when this lagoon gets really hot and starts blowing in? And they said, well, they bring their trucks and they suck it up and they drive out to the tundra and they dump the sewage on the tundra. So all of these little sites and all of these little brown spots that you can see, here is Catalyst, Apex, and these are all contaminated waste sites, just in Catalyst. Here is another waste site close to the dump. This is military, actually. This is where the military drove a whole bunch of their vehicles just over the side of the little mound, and then they drove them over and have left them there for, it's unclear how many years, maybe in the 1970s, something like that. Here's another waste site. There's the dew line. Here's another waste site that's close to the penitentiary and the college residence and blah, blah, blah. And this is leaking. I'm hoping it's just oil. So I was watching on it, I don't know. Here's some more barrels, leaking stuff. Here is another part of this dump site which has asbestos, which is just flying around in the air. Here's Alex. My grad student. I wanted to show this picture because we had this really bright idea of walking across Frobisher Bay when the tide was out, like only idiots from the south would do this, right? And to try and get to this waste site that we could see in the far west, we knew there was a waste site there. So we walked across, and of course, this is where the sewage thing is. So we're literally, walking in shit. And so I was telling Alex, yeah, work with me. Anyway, and I threw this one in just because I think it's interesting. This is the graveyard, another form of waste, right? Necro waste, and it's literally was built on the road to nowhere. It's a road there called the road to nowhere, and they built this, spent millions of dollars building this graveyard, only to find that they can't actually dig it up to put bodies in the ground because of the permafrost, and it's all rocky. So now they've abandoned that one and they're building another one. So here are a bunch of recyclables. So this is wood that's been, people have gathered together, and there's they got a sort of a chipper, but the chipper is broken and no one knows how to fix it, so it's just piling up there. There's one guy who's trying to recycle cans, but when I was talking to him, he was saying that it's costing him money to do it. He's just this guy who owns a bric-a-brac shop, and he thought, I should do something with these cans. So now so people have started bringing them there, and now he's got all these cans, and he can't actually ship them to the south anymore because it's too expensive. So he wasn't sure what he was going to do with these, but I'm going to guess they're just going to sit there. You get the idea, yeah. Okay, so how has waste become a neo-colonial symptom? It's part of the colonial context within which Inuit and other Aboriginal peoples in northern Canada continue to live. Neo-colonial governments leads to the configuration of waste as capitalism's fallout, its unanticipated supplement, which can be managed as a technological issue. There's a ton of stuff up there about what they really need a proper landfill. Now they voted to have an incinerator up there, etc. And one of individual responsibility, which is recycling. But perhaps, Alex and I want to argue, perhaps the failure of waste in Canada's northern communities to conform to southern governments may be understood as a living with a historical colonial legacy that continues to indelibly shape the landscape. Waste is a provocative material with which to think about neocoloniality because of the important part this concept has played and continues to play in, quotes, excluding certain groups of people from specific social, political, and physical spaces. The long-standing policy of associating waste, dirt, and disease with colonized peoples as a justification for practices of subjugation certainly offers insights into waste as a cultural signifier. But in the context of the Anthropocene, waste takes on, we argue, a distinct hue. And I'm going to return to this. The Anthropocene, as we know, captures this recognition and interest in the simultaneous operation of human-created infrastructures and global political economic practices characteristic of industrial capitalism and geological processes stretching back through deep time. Whether in the form of mining, nuclear, industrial, hazardous, sewage, or municipal, and whether it's dumped, landfilled, incinerated, or buried deep underground, waste constitutes perhaps the most abundant and enduring trace of humans for epochs to come. And while stratigraphers are, dithering over where to put that golden spike, or even whether we're going to put that golden spike, the real provocation of the Anthropocene is not that we're leaving a message for some imagined future humanity or geologists to decipher, but we're bequeathing a particular futurity through a projected responsibility. The Anthropocene, as Chakravarty argues, recharacterizes this neocolonial subject as both the colonized and this re-indigenized person, yeah? The history of Canada's waste, we want to argue, is inseparable from the colonial legacy as U.S. and Canadian military, as well as Southern prospectors, industry, and settlers, both introduced waste to the north and, for the most part, have abandoned it there. This past and waste's future promise, the fallout of increased oil, gas, and mineral extraction, military installations, shipping, and the tourist trade to the health of humans and non-humans, projects a responsibility to present and future generations to resolve, right? And they've got all these things going on in their classrooms as well. Recycle, take out your garbage. And while the Anthropocene speaks of this universal subject, we want to emphasize that this universal, the effects of the Anthropocene are very differentially experienced. So I just wanted to, let's see. The sites that I've just been talking about in Callaway are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to waste in the north, right? And there's just a few, here's just a few examples. So no one really knows, but the estimate is that there are about 27,000 what are called orphan mines. These are mines that the mining companies have just abandoned. And that then falls to the federal government, i.e. taxpayers, to remediate these mining sites. Cosmos 954, this was when a Soviet satellite fell out of the atmosphere and landed in the Northwest Territories, distributing huge amounts of radioactive material. We've got persistent organic pollutants up in the north. This is what's called the grasshopper effect, that are accumulating in country food and fauna. There are numerous pipelines up in the north, right? And some of these pipelines when the corporations are done with the pipelines, they leave everything, including, in this case, when the U.S. Army stopped working on this, they abandoned hundreds of trucks, graders, construction equipment, plus 60,476 barrels of oil in the pipe and some 108,857 barrels that were just spilled on the landscape. The disposal of sewage and grey water is controlled in Canada, except in the Arctic Sea, where, quotes, any ship and any person on a ship may deposit in Arctic waters such sewage as may be generated. So as we know, yay, global warming, we've got now tourist ships. And when I was up in August, they brought up the Canadian military to do exercises with sinking, supposedly sinking tourist ships that are going through the Northwest Passage and going up into the Arctic, and they can all dump their sewage and all of their garbage into the Arctic Ocean, written in our laws. The microplastics that we all hear about, all these gyres, yeah, they accumulate particularly in Canada's north, where various sea organisms are ingesting them, dying, etc. Okay. You get it, right? I'm really just so over-hammering this. All right. Waste in Nunavut, of course, must vie for attention in a northern context of myriad social issues. Inuit in Nunavut have amongst the lowest household incomes in the country, and the difference in the average income between Inuit and Calumet is striking. In 2005, the average income of a non-Inuit Nunavut residents is $70,000. That is researchers and government and other people, while Inuit residents earn just over $22,000. Nearly 60% of those living in Nunavut smoke, ranking at the highest per capita in the country. Residents have high levels of diabetes, heart disease, and other diet-related illnesses, and Nunavut households experience food insecurity at a rate 7 times higher than the Canadian average. In Iqaluit's 2 grocery stores, food comes highly packaged or nearing its expiration date. Because there are no roads connecting Iqaluit to the south or to other communities, as there are in, say, White Horse and Yellowknife, supplies arrive by air or sea, which increases both the cost and packaging of shipped materials. Violence against women is a major issue, and the single women's shelter struggles to meet the overwhelming need. Substance abuse is a major problem, and alcohol can only be purchased in restaurants and hotels. Suicide rates are 10 times higher in Nunavut than in the rest of Canada. I'll give you this quote from one of the interviews that we collected. Waste in the north is all about teaching Inuit to actually waste. Before colonialization, there wasn't waste in the north, right? Settlers, the military have brought all this waste, yeah? Most of Iqaluit's short history, because Iqaluit's a very young city, involves Southern Canadians and Americans teaching Inuit to waste. Prior to settlement in Nunavut, Inuit were semi-nomadic and relied solely on the land for their subsistence and survival. 1 or 2 Inuit families together hunted a variety of seasonal animals for food, clothing, tools, and other necessities. In the summer, caribou skin was used to make summer tents, and in the winter, snow and ice was used to make igloo, and sod was used to make houses. As Nunavut remarks, traditionally Inuit society was garbageless. All our stuff was either edible by dogs or naturally degradable. At this time, very little waste was created, and any discards that had been produced by Inuit communities wouldn't have been considered waste in the southern way in which we understand it. Inuit visited the area of Iqaluit for fishing, hunting, but it wasn't until the U.S. military selected it as a region for a World War II air base that Inuit began moving there into year-round settlements. And it's a slow, if you're interested, I can give you this paper, and it's a slow movement of Inuit into Iqaluit and staying there. The U.S. military being a big presence, the Canadian military as well, and a movement of this semi-nomadic lifestyle into a paid, albeit temporary, sporadic workforce of Inuit working for the American military, the Canadian military, and Canadian government representatives, ironically often in things like, not just an industry, not just in terms of mining, etc., but in terms of cleaning. So we, doing some archival research, I'm just going to skip through a whole bunch of this stuff, but in our archival research, we found that some really, really interesting documents written by government representatives from Ottawa talking about how Inuit living in, so of course there was, government housing and everything, but Inuit usually made their own housing from the debris left over by the government and industry and military. And there are consistently throughout these documents these Southerners talking about how dirty Inuit were, that they were, buying clothes from the Hudson's Bay Company, and they would wear their clothes until they would literally fall off their bodies, and that they, lived in these shacks, and of course, one of the central labor that Inuit provided for the American, Canadian military, etc., was cleaning. So they would go in and clean and take away the sewage, etc., of all of these, these settlers and southern people, all reports are being written. So that you get lots of different things there. For instance, there's a guidebook written that was targeted to Inuit women and their children about how to keep a clean home, and the teachers who were doing all of these were putting on courses teaching Inuit women how to bathe their children and how to keep their homes clean. Homes being one room. And writing how disappointed they were that these women seemed totally disinterested in these courses and would often wander off in the middle of being talked to about proper hygiene, etc., etc. So that kind of entirely unreflexive, easy to critique because it's just such a given. There's quite a lot of this archival research. The long story, which is really long in what I've written, which I'm lucky for you, I'm not going to go through, is the long story short is that the history of Iqaluit in terms of waste is a history of the South bringing waste to the North, leaving it there for Inuit to deal with, amongst all of these highly pressing issues like youth suicide, like food insecurity, etc. There's a massive housing crisis there, as we know, etc. Right? So, and these are just some various quotes from, which I hope you're not listening to me, but you're just reading these quotes about, I'm just sorry. This is at the airport. You go into the washroom when you first arrive there, and it's syphilis is on the rise. These kinds of things. So I won't go through it. But these are some good quotes here. This is from Zebedee. As a boy, I had an innocent ambition to be like Iqaluit, non-Inuit people in the North, white men. The measure of my success would be when my garbage equaled theirs. Just a great, really great quotes. This whole thing about needing to live in communities, right? We didn't need television, we didn't need rifles, we didn't need snowmobiles. We were living just fine the way we were. And this white man comes and says, oh, you need shelter, you need furniture to get status in your life, you need pots and pans. But we didn't. We were fine the way we were. As soon as the white man said, you need to be in communities, you're all scattered all over the place. And then the government said, we got used to money. And the government said, if you want more money, you got to, talking about yesterday, you got to send your kids to schools in the South. And this happened in Iqaluit and other northern communities as well, right? So, and this idea, of course, is very much wrapped up in this idea of this sort of self-determination, right? This helping Inuit to be able to govern themselves, this completely Eurocentric, colonial idea, right? And I like this, we've adapted for thousands of years to the harshest conditions, and all of a sudden, gee, we can't do it. We need other people to do it for us. Yeah. So here's my sort of last section. The true North, strong and free. This is, if you're not Canadian, this is a little blurb from our national anthem. In a refrain of Canada's national anthem, Prime Minister Stephen Harper recently stated at the 2009 G20 summit that Canada has, and I'm quoting our Prime Minister here, no history of colonialism. Harper reiterated the government's stance that Canada is a nation whose resources and opportunities are shared equally by all citizens, as well as denying hundreds of years of old world dependence on Canadian resources and of prospectors and settlers' dependence on Aboriginal peoples for survival, navigation, hunting, and labor, all of which inspired the material and cultural subjugation of Canada's original peoples. Harper's statement exemplifies the liberal state that Michel Foucault identified that, quote, justifies its jurisdiction on a type of origin net. Faced with the long and deep history of Aboriginal peoples in what became Canada, Ash argues that Europeans chose to identify colonial settlement as the sovereignty's historical starting point. And the Crown, the Crown has declared Canada a terra nullius before colonization. And this absurdium was actually reiterated by the Supreme Court of Canada recently. Embedded in the colonial imagination of sovereignty is the messy juxtaposition of the Arctic as simultaneously the true North, strong and free, a remote and pristine landscape whose innocent history embodies an aesthetic of uncontained and uncontaminated wilderness. The North is Canada's largest and most diverse emerging resource for industrial extraction. a vital piece of the circumpolar pie that we're all vying for, right? And increasingly, the North is an anthropogenic trace, and therefore a symbolic pinnacle for global sustainable development. The dramatic increase in demand for northern natural resources over the past 20 years has only intensified with the prospect of climate change making these resources more accessible. According to Aboriginal Affairs in Northern Development Canada, the North contains about 25% of Canada's remaining discovered recoverable crude oil and natural gas, and about 40% of Canada's projected future discoveries, some $26 billion in potential non-renewable resource projects. This means more people and equipment moving temporarily from south to north, much more drilling and extraction, and inevitably more waste. On his annual northern tour last year, Harper described the North as, quote, a great treasure house whose resources must be utilized. And building on the colonial legacy of teaching Inuit how to be white, quotes, the government has funded education and skills training programs to help Northerners learn the skills to help dig up all that gold and iron ore and mine those diamonds. A technocratic language of environmental management is increasingly eclipsing debates about Inuit control over land and sea that includes not only the interests of scientists and conservationists in land stewardship, climate regulation, and biodiversity, but of oil and gas and mineral mining, tourist and other southern corporates. Once again, Inuit self-determination and land rights have fused Inuit rights and resources into a single issue. Inuit rights over northern development in areas of oil and gas exploration, hunting and fishing is now advanced on the grounds of thousands of years of successful Inuit stewardship, which seems to accord Inuit peoples at long last with self-determination. However, Inuit stewardship is formulated within terms that assume resource development as a given, and moreover, as Jessica Shadian argues, within a discourse that corroborates Canada's Western neoliberal ideology. In other words, Inuit have rights because of their status as Canadians, and it is the needs of Canadians as a whole, i.e. resource extraction, profit, global corporate investment, and employment, that defines the terms of sustainable development in the North. As the Canadian government's Northern Strategy states, and I'm quoting it, Canada's North is a fundamental part of Canada. Wow, lucky for us Southerners. It's part of, that's not a quote. It's part of our heritage, our future, and our identity as a country. The government has a vision for a new North and is taking action to ensure that vision comes to life for the benefit of all Canadians. As such, Indigenous people have in effect been engaged in a massive program of foreign aid to urban populations of the industrialized North. The North has been in this foreign aid to us in the South for the past several hundred years. Thus, through contemporary interests in development, Inuit communities are being assimilated into greatly expanding industrial corporate interests in the North through casual resource extraction labor, capacity building, training, and the tourist trade. For Inuit, the North is a place of complicated histories of violence, subjugation, and collective memory and landscape. Researchers continue to identify the multitudinous human health and environmental risks that attend northern development, such as living with contamination. The strategic interest in the North, first as a military defense site in the 1950s, and then as a site for resource extraction and development that's been accelerating since the oil crisis in the 1970s, continues to promise the spoils of Western civilization to Inuit peoples: more jobs, more training, more money, and greater investment. But as we know, this is not what happens, right? Thus, amongst whatever dividends Inuit may or may not actually accrue, and numerous studies demonstrate that many are peripheral and temporary, problems associated with what is known as the staples trap or resource curse, northern development ultimately leaves substantial waste in its wake. And I'm quoting here Simon, who says, "Today, the greatest and certainly the most direct threat to the security of Arctic residents stems from damage to the environment. The Arctic, in effect, has been treated as a dumping ground by government, military establishments, and industries concerned only with the needs of southern societies. If the ubiquitous waste that litters the North's landscape is a fallout of the colonial past, then the prospect of far more waste generated through northern resource development may categorize what Gregory refers to as Canada's colonial present." And I just want to conclude here. Municipal solid, mining, and other myriad forms of waste constitute the anthropogenic legacy of terminal capitalism's profound fallout, underwritten by ideologies of development and modernization. In significant ways, modern waste management is a manifestation of the West's colonial tradition, and its implementation requires an assimilation to predetermined neoliberal market-based notions of what waste is and how it should be managed. For most southern communities in Canada, waste is out of sight and out of mind, an ironic testimony to a desire to forget. In this way, waste, both conceptually and materially, marks the success of the neo-colonial project, its proliferation indicative of the Enlightenment's de-indigenization or separation of humans from the environment. Yet within the Anthropocene logos, the neo-colonial subject is both the colonized and the re-indigenized, since colonizers no longer exist as separate from the environment. This is what we're all talking about, right? The imperial legacy thus shifts from, as Spivak says, white men saving brown women from brown men, to white culture saving brown culture from white culture. In the northern Canadian waste landscape, this equates to teaching the colonial subject to, in the first instance, waste, and then to mimic southern ways of dealing with waste, all the while maintaining the image of the North as a landscape amenable to sustainable development. Southern waste management focuses heavily on downstream techno-scientific responses rather than upstream concerns with the material and ethical implications of the vast amount of waste that Southerners have already brought to the North, as well as the increasing amounts of hazardous and non-hazardous waste that the current resource rush of the North gives. Discussions of the Anthropocene emphasize the bequeathing of environmental risk, thresholds, and crises to future generations, including the apocalyptic foreclosure of these future generations themselves. Yet waste is not an anthropocenic figure, despite the close relationship between matters of acknowledged concern, fossil fuels, climate change, and biodiversity loss, and waste management's de-stratification of resources that requires the use of immense tracts of land, the destruction of habitats, contamination, and the colossal use of fossil fuels. Landfill, mining, openly dumped, and other forms of waste and their environmental contamination are bequeathed from previous generations, gifts of leaking and spilling leachate, abandoned mines, arsenic trioxide tailings, and so on. This dubious inheritance assumes a particularly troubling view when we consider neo-colonialist inheritance of Canada's north. Experts estimate the longevity of state-of-the-art landfills in terms less than 100 years, and that's if every step of the siting, construction, maintenance, and aftercare process is followed according to the strictest instructions, after which levels of toxicity are hoped to have dissipated. Mining waste remediation doesn't even carry this anticipatory promise, as landfilling and nuclear waste repositories do, of decreasing danger, right? At least, radioactive material has the decency to have a half-life, right? This isn't the case for other forms of waste. If, by acknowledging the Anthropocene, we have all become re-indigenized, that is, we've never been distinguished from the geologic, then the question becomes how to decolonize ourselves. The Anthropocene may depend upon a universal human species as a geologic force, but surviving ongoing neocolonialism may resemble something quite different. Perhaps the kind of waste practices very visible in Iqaluit and other northern communities, which might explain why southern Canadians typically appeal to the need to introduce modern waste management in Canada's north. But unlike the subaltern, which Spivak famously argued cannot speak, perhaps Inuit peoples are rejecting southern solutions to the Anthropocene by choosing not to speak in ways that conform to a colonial legacy that separates waste from resource, dirt from clean, and uncivilized from civilized. And I leave with Hornaday's great quote, which I think says something better than the Anthropocene. And I thank you very much. That was a race through. If you're Cuba may or may not loosely or tightly fit into that category. I don't know. I'm looking at Canadian waste. So not to say that there's, these cross-national comparisons are really, really important. But my cross-national comparisons are Sweden, France, not Cuba. But it'd be interesting. I'm sure people are doing research on it. People research everything. So I'm sure there's some enthusiastic grad student who's in Cuba right now looking at waste. Ben?
Yeah, I love hearing this. It's really interesting. And when I listen at certain points in the talk, I think I hear like you citing rhetorically that beautiful way in which, say, Foucault opens history of sexuality, in which he says, we all know that sexuality was repressed, and we know when it started, and now we all want to be liberated, and then he turns and he says, actually, we weren't repressed at all, we were incited to talk about it. And when you present that part of the paper talk about kids, like we're incited to talk, we're incited to practice, we're incited to think. And in history of sexuality, what he was, of course, trying to do is say, actually, if we pay attention to how we're incited to talk and practice and be, then we'll be able to see this formation of power we're in. And when he was writing that, it was a very different formation of power than we thought, or it's a different way of approaching, say, liberalism than we thought, because we couldn't think about liberalism as the will of the people, the democratic, right? But rather we had to think about it through this idea of population, self-management. Okay. So whenever I'm hearing you give this talk and I'm hearing you rhetorically cite him, I'm thinking, so what are you saying that if we switch the figure from sexuality to recycling, will we see this different formation of power? Now, I have my own thoughts about it, so but I'm very curious what you see as how we would conceptualize the formation of power we're in now. Again, if we say it's not part of sexuality, sexuality still continues to do a certain kind of work, but it has decisively also shifted to this other kind of subject, i.e. your recycling subject.
I really like that. Yeah, Canadians talk more about recycling than sex, yeah.
And it's hard, you can't date someone unless they recycle.
And the great thing is that, we can, who feels anxious about talking to their children about recycling?
Yeah.
It kind of avoids that whole sex problem for kids, right? Because, people are probably doing this with, 6 months old. That's a fantastic provocation, and I've never thought of that. That sort of takeover discourse, right? Like, what's the object of incitement? What's the object of discourse? Yeah, I think that's a really interesting provocation. To do justice to it, I need to think about that for a bit. But I think it's fascinating that what we talk about in the South with regards to garbage is actually, diversion and specifically recycling, and that we've built up this whole cadre of notions about recycling that aren't borne out with evidence, but it's become so important to us. And again, as not an early childhood educator, I was kind of panicked when they invited me to come and give this talk. So I don't know anything about, but that surely resonates with early childhood educators still, right? There's got to be tons of stuff about, like I kept thinking about the exhibition last night, like what happens to all that stuff? Like, I heard Sandrina say that the paper gets used over years or whatever, but eventually in so-called negative terms, as some may interpret I'm doing today, that's a really unpopular thing to do. Super unpopular. So this might be my last public talk. We'll see. But and that says something, doesn't it? Right? That's the no-go land to critique, recycling. It's such a good thing.
Myra, here is your last question.
Oh, today. Yeah, please. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was great in so many different ways. So I'd like to just focus on two things that got me thinking. One is the notion of re-indigenization, because indigeneity is used in so many different ways. And I would like to ask you to talk a little bit more about that. The second thing is the objecting politics. And Spiva talks about the difficulties we have to hear to the subaltern when what we want to hear is not what is being said, and the intelligibility of that. So my personal experience being married to a First Nations person is that there is a very strong pushback on environmental citizenship. So the refusal to recycle, for example, can be read as a refusal to be managed, a refusal of governmentality in that sense. But it is very difficult, especially in the beginning, for me to frame it like that. For me, it was something else. So how intelligible is it for us to want to hear to this Inuit people pushing back on that when our subjectivities are framed by and constrained by our own ontology? How can we not just pick up an epistemology and graft it back onto our ontology and only hear what we want to hear? That's all right.
Yeah, well, that's the $10 million questions, right? But let me take a stab at it. Okay, re-indigenization. Yeah, I find this really interesting. I was reading Chuck Bernie's work for another thing, and I came across this whole, what does the Anthropocene mean in terms of indigeneity? And I think he was very much, provoked by Spivak's work, right? He talks about this, and his argument is that, yeah, this is what the Anthropocene means. It means finally, the final collapse that, we're all talking about, in our anti-enlightenment stuff, about the collapse of the separation between humans and environment, right? Humans are environment, which then the corollary for post-colonial studies, or, I know that's a controversial term, but for the sake of brevity, I'll just use it. What does this mean then for indigeneity? And what it means is, of course, the whole human population of this planet becomes re-indigenized in that sense, right? It's the Anthropocene is implicitly borrowing from, stealing, usurping, whatever we want to say, from those indigenous cosmologies that do not separate human from environment. But then, of course, that means, we're all indigenous now. Yikes, right? Is that what that's what the Anthropocene in many discursive formulations is saying. Now we're all indigenous. And as Sandrina said in her talk yesterday, about the more than human or the inhuman or whatever, non-human, whatever we want to say. Yeah, right. Just as we are, trying desperately to be counted as humans, now it's all about the inhuman, right? Well, now with the Anthropocene, look, we're all indigenous. Wow, look, I'm indigenous. So that's what we're struggling with waste and that's why Alex and I keep saying in the second part of the paper about insofar as that's what the Anthropocene is arguing, the Anthropocene must also be arguing for the very, very differential experiences of indigeneity and what it means to live environment, because these are very strongly differentially experienced on this planet. Yeah. So I don't know if that helps with the first one, but the second one is now about yes, how we hear it. Yes, of course. Well, I didn't say it here because you focus on some things when you talk in others, but when you look at what's going on in Cali and other areas in Northern it's certainly the case that there's a lot of, the dominant discourse, if you read newspapers, you go to city council meetings, you do lots of interviews, blah, blah, is about very southern ways of talking about waste. Like, tourists come and they're so, and I've actually hung out with, tourists that I just happened to meet, what do you think? They all comment, God, I'm so, there's a couple of British people who were like wearing perks, they were freezing to death. And they were standing there and they were saying they didn't realize it'd be so cold in August, but then they were also saying, they were so disappointed because there's litter everywhere. And, they come to Canada's north. It's this beautiful place with white polar bears and it's so beautiful and it's this gorgeous landscape and then they find that there are pop bottles everywhere and there's litter everywhere. And there is, like you can't walk anywhere without you walking all over garbage. They're so disappointed, and so that it's very much the dominant discourse, and I've talked to lots of government representatives there, is about cleaning up Iqaluit, cleaning up the north, and so we need modern landfills, we need incinerators, we need possibly biogas and pyrolysis, and we need to figure out a way to ship the waste down to the south. And lots of different things have been tried. Composting was tried in Iqaluit. Lots of different things are tried, and they all failed. And I think that failure is very interesting. It's discussed in terms of technological failure, but I don't think it's technological failure at all. I think it's political failure. And I don't mean that to say that the city council is failing. Far from it. I think what is failing is a southern notion of democracy, of a southern notion of participating publics. I also am not claiming that Inuit people in Iqaluit are leaving pop cans on the landscape because they are objecting. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is possibly what we're seeing there is a different form of public, of a different way of understanding environment, of understanding humans, of understanding all of these things that so much of our politics is predicated on, that just doesn't fit with this southern landscape. And I think that is very intriguing. I'm overjoyed when I go to places and I see litter everywhere, because it's right there, and it means people are encountering it right there. I don't like it when I go to places where I don't see any waste, because it's lying, as Deborah Bird-Rose said so much better than I ever could. Yeah? So I think it's intriguing that not that there's all this waste up there, but what's happening with it. And yes, of course, it's all being, moved into this, oh God, look, and, along with the suicide and blah, 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 man, they gotta clean up their waste too. Jeez, something else is going on there. And the fact that everything fails, I